Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welkom bij de vierde lezing in onze Open for Discussion Gespreksserie. My name is Michael Andrés Forero Parra. I am a Colombian architect and museologist, and my pronouns are he and they. I am a member of the Curatorial Research Collective at the Technical University in Eindhoven, where I'm researching the networks of an extraordinary but little known exhibition program devoted to architecture in Colombia in the 1980s. I am also the co-founder of Museo Q, that is Museum Q, a museological initiative that brings queer lives to museums, galleries, botanical gardens, and very soon libraries. So I will be moderating today's session. But before we start, and since we are going to talk about queering architecture, I must ask for your support. There is a trans organization in Colombia called Red Comunitaria Trans, that is the Transgender Community Network. They work for the rights of the trans population in Colombia and help many sex workers and low-income trans individuals. Sadly, due to the pandemic, they are on the brink of homelessness. They want to find a new trans house in Bogota. So if you can help, please make a donation. I will share the information in the chat and as a comment on YouTube. And if you cannot make a donation, you can help our trans sisters sharing the info with your colleagues, friends, and lovers. And I thank you for that. For our talk series, we decided to open up a series of discussions on what we all recognize as a persistent problem that architecture has with diversity and representation. The last 2 weeks, the discussions focus on architecture education, and you can find those recordings on Casa Vertigo YouTube channel. They were really good. And with our talk today, we focus on diverse practices and strategies which integrate different gender perspectives and reflections on dissident sexualities in the architecture profession. And I have invited two amazing speakers. They will have 10 to 15 minutes to talk and share their work. And then we will have plenty of time for questions. Please use the Q&A box if you are on Zoom, and if it's easy to use the chat, please feel free to put questions and comments there. I will try my best to collect all the questions, so don't be shy. You can transform this space. Your questions are relevant. Ask whatever you want. The first of our speakers is Adam Nathaniel Furman. Adam is an artist and designer of Argentine and Japanese heritage based in London. They studied architecture and fine art and have worked in those areas as well as products, interiors, writing, and teaching. Their work has been exhibited widely, including a solo show at the Sir John Soane Museum and is in the collections of the Design Museum in London, the National Gallery of Victoria, and other institutions. Adam will talk about belonging, not belonging. I will present our second speaker after Adam's presentation. So go ahead, Adam, and welcome.
Thank you. Okay, apologies, this is far too many slides, so I will time myself and try and stick to it so I don't go over. I'm a Londoner, and I grew up in London, which ostensibly is a kind of very welcoming place. But it was actually, growing up, there was sort of, I guess, an interesting experience with quite a lot of negativity kind of hanging over being queer at that time. I came out very young, when I was about 15 in the sort of late 90s in school. And the context was kind of Section 28, which was a law that was put into the statute book by Margaret Thatcher, which meant that there was the promotion of homosexuality was not allowed by schools or metropolitan or local authorities, which basically meant that there was a kind of hostile, cold environment where someone like me could get bullied so badly that they were then kicked out of the school because they were blamed for the bullying that they were going through. And the topic of the homosexuality being the kind of basis of that persecution was never discussed because of the sort of Section 28, and that was until 2002, I believe. I was just down the road from a bomb which killed several people in Soho in the late 90s. There was a lot of sort of right-wing movement against queer people, and yet at the same time it was a really vibrant scene, and there was a kind of incredibly strong pushback because of the kind of because of the negative context. And I was very lucky to be able to leave or to get out of my school and find solace in places. For instance, I did my A levels in a gay pub where I was accepted, I was protected, I was taught that I was worthy, that I was, you know, not the sort of nothing that the school and the people in school said I was. And I also sort of discovered nightclubs, discovered protest groups, discovered political groups, discovered music scenes within the queer community. This is what Johnny Wu is standing in for on that slide. And all of up with aesthetics. So there was everyone I came across and all in different sort of subcultural scenes, they were all expressing their difference, and they were expressing their political positions, they were expressing their proud identities in a visual manner. So they were manifesting their existence through the way things looked. And then I sort of amazingly got into university and studied architecture, and it was sort of this very, very different environment. It was sort of lots of really miserable, angry people wearing black, crying in making people cry in corridors, producing black models, and telling me that basically everything that I was once again was bad. So it's sort of like an academic version of the bullying that had happened in school. So it wasn't physical anymore, but it was very much a sort of oppressive aesthetic environment that was never actually intellectually justified. And so my life has been a kind of process of coming out in a forceful way, and it's meant that I've had to be quite antagonistic because I've had to, in these sort of architectural environments, I've had to sort of justify my desire to express myself in an aesthetic manner through visual culture as a form of identity expression, which is something that is absolutely not allowed within the architecture and the urban environment. You're sort of allowed to exist as a queer person, but not necessarily to embody it in your work in a visual manner, as long you can in terms of a programmatic content. And I sort of went hell for leather, pushing to a very extreme way. This is back in the early 2000s in a context of sort of people, I don't know, masturbating with beautiful pieces of concrete, frankly what I felt like they were doing, or sort of creating 3D printed models that look like alien squid. I was sort of producing these sorts of pieces which are sort of quite critically constructing a world for myself that was about not only my queer identity but also the multicultural, multi-ethnic and multi-religious background that I came from. So complete mess, didn't fit in with anything that was there, but was trying to embody it in a positive way. And I sort of brought that to every aspect of the architectural process. So from model making, people were 3D printing, and they were trying to make things that looked like, or sort of ossified bird bones, because there was a particular look that things had to be technological and look technological if they were using technology, and therefore that was technological. It's kind of ridiculous sort of intellectual circularity. And so I was sort of using 3D printing at an early stage in a different manner for aesthetic embodiment, and was producing things like this, and was
Adam,
yeah.
Can you use the presentation mode? Someone in the audience.
Oh, sorry.
You can just.
Oh God, thank you for pointing that out. I'm so sorry to everyone. It's like I thought that only I could see those. Okay, I'll go with. Is that okay, Michael? Great. Okay. And the same thing when it came to sort of working at a larger scale. I always wanted to work at a larger scale, and from early on, I was sort of collaborating with companies to be able to produce structural elements, and sort of but approaching them in a way that wasn't sort of that material is a simple expression of materiality and structure is a simple expression of structure, but actually ornament and expression sort of working themselves in. I graduated, and the world ended in 2008, and there were no opportunities. And my generation, I'm apparently called a geriatric millennial. There were lots of us who were sort of trying to find ways to produce things without necessarily having to have jobs. And I tried to find like-minded souls in London who would want to produce, I guess, quite queer architecture with me. But unfortunately, lots of people, it was sort of groups of like-minded people who wanted to produce socially aware things that were made of wood for people in certain council estates. And I just didn't fit in. I sort of respect what they do. I wanted to do stuff like this. And aside from sort of joining which I sort of had 1 feet in, sort of like going into sort of the world of festivals, performance, pride. There wasn't really many opportunities to be able to explore that. So I did a lot of paperwork, paper architecture. I harnessed social media from very early on to be able to find my own audiences, and sort of being able to craft I mean, I had a job pushing toilets around on Revit, actually pushing handrails around on Revit for months on end. But I was sort of doing little things on the side, the paper architecture, also teaching any courses I could. I couldn't ever become a studio master, but I could get these little courses and push it very far, kind of queering materialities. So I love ceramics. It's this kind of very hands-on material. And I taught the students how to sort of use digital tools, digital fabricating together with the making of the hand, together with exploring their own aesthetics and building things. And every opportunity, bit by bit, as they grew, I really explored those questions, which tended to coalesce around sensual form, color, and sort of querying of both the surface and technology that uses to make it. So this is 3D printed ceramics. I think this was the largest 3D printed glazed ceramic at the world at the time. Someone dropped it, so it no longer exists. So my career was kind of built up out of making little objects or small things, which I didn't, I wanted to build skyscrapers, but it fit me very well in the end. I was an antiques dealer, got me through university. I love objects, and for me, they're kind of part of this process of identity formation, which has been very important for me, which I think kind of relates to both the female, the queer, but also any groups that don't necessarily fit in, or people who have bodies that don't fit in. So if you're born with a body that doesn't fit the world outside, if you're born with a body that people make you feel ashamed of, if you're born with a body that wants to do things with other bodies that people tell you should be ashamed of, you can't express yourself outside, you can't be safe outside, you can't be who you want to be, you're always putting on a mask. So the closet is really important, not just the idea of coming out the closet, but the closet is really important for me because it's a way that a person like that, I'm one of those, there's many of you like that, can construct themselves through the very first form of architecture, which is the clothing and makeup. And you can build a fortress. You can create that identity of a self with which you feel comfortable, that recognizes you, that externalizes yourself in a way that the outside world doesn't, with the specularity of the mirror. And then you do the same thing. You externalize yourself into the room around you through objects. And objects, I think, are sort of the opposite of this very masculine idea of space. It's the kind of universal, extensive idea of space that the architect controls. It's an abstract notion that doesn't exist. And the object for me is the opposite of that. It's the specific, the granular, it's the thing that contains meaning. It's the thing which for me embodies in many ways a kind of queer approach to design that is inclusive, broken, and can change. And the interior for me is a collection of objects, and it's very potent, and it's something that humans naturally do. We express ourselves externally. The very first things that we did was we painted on caves. Then after that, we tattooed ourselves. Then we made jewelry. The very first thing we did when we made architecture was the architecture of weaving. Right? We made tents outside, and we didn't just weave plain, beautiful fabrics that are just plain. We immediately started creating patterns that embodied our hierarchies, our environments, our social mores. And then beyond that, beyond jewelry, beyond that, we also decorate our spaces, and we do that today inherently or sort of naturally, biologically, into the spaces around us. If you're a social climber and you want to show off how sophisticated you are, you might use John Pawson to make a minimalist interior, but that is nonetheless a form of social indication externalized outside of your identity. There are very few architects who've done that in a kind of very concerted way that I might consider queer, and a brilliant example. Charles Moore is a very unusual example of an architect who was both high in academia but also profoundly other. He was kicked out of university in the McCarthy era for being a suspected buggerer. And this kind of haunted him throughout his career, but he was also effusively and brilliantly a sort of progenitor of collections and kind of really unusual and unexpected connections between things over time. This is an approach I've explored through multiple projects, but specifically Identity Parade at the Design Museum. I created a scenario, which I often do, of a person who was locked in his room for 3 months, like a hikikomori, and that person, which to be honest was me. I mean, I was working during the day, but then I was up all night. Had to make an object every day, and that object had to be delivered either through the post, so 3D printed or laser cut, or had to be made at home by clay. way. And this was me doing it. And each one of those had to embody, and I kind of wrote a story for them, the contemporary experience of basically a queer character living disassociated from the rest of society. And so the idea was to create design that was separate from consumerism or clients, that was just an embodiment of identity. And I very much lived this experience. And, you know, I mean, there's lots of videos of me licking things, which tend to do this way I relate to objects. But I created, you know, all of these stories and scenarios which embodied these objects, which are basically souvenirs of a moment in somebody's life, sort of a little encapsulation of their identity, this person's identity. And they became kind of very loaded vessels. And then this person died. I felt like I was about to die, but he died narratively from taking too many Pro Plus caffeine pills. And then the entire studio was put into the design museum. And it works really well, this idea of an entire environment. And I think the idea of narrative is very kind of, for me, sorry, this is just entirely personal, but the entire idea of narrative is a kind of very Catholic, sort of modernist, masculine, paternalistic idea of content that must be didactic, explained, logical, and coherent. Now, for me, atmosphere, okay, that living room that's just a mess, the eloquence of silent objects in relation to each other, that for me is content, and it's not explicated. And so for me, this is just a version of creating that on my own for a contemporary designer. This was a long time ago, sort of like 8 years ago, but I had quite an impact. Mostly people hating it, but in the design world, but that's another story. And I've sort of continued that approach with each of my sort of products. I tend to think of them as sort of a little moment in time in that manner. And they're sort of little slices of my personality, but they're also cheeky takes. Very often they're cheeky takes, so making fun, but in a really loving way, of kind of holy.
It seems Adam got freeze, or maybe it's
which is about the ambiguity of gender. I've got the timer, so I've got a little bit more time. And I very quickly, I did that with urbanism. I will explain this at another point if any of you want me to explain, with the Rome Prize project, where I kind of looked at alternative histories, kind of queer stories, female stories, but also really gross, terrible stories, but just so different historiographies of buildings. And I kind of embodied them, and I wrote articles every 2 weeks that were published on the Architectural Review, so there's kind of like substantial content there as well, but each of them were turned into a souvenir, the souvenir becoming in my work the embodiment of an object which is brilliantly eloquent, and which other people can I guess intellectuals can dismiss as being superficial and unserious, but are actually incredibly powerful distillations of complexity in an eloquent manner. And I produced that. So color is very important to me as the tool of speaking in a very eloquent way through the body, essentially, without language, non-didactically. I've taken that seriously, and I've run the Saturated Space Research Group for the past 10 years at the Architectural Association. We've published lots of texts. There's one that's just gone up, and we've had lots of symposia. Color is very important, and I tend to talk about how we use it as a form of dragging, and then that drag race show became very popular, and I stopped referring to it as dragging. But I guess it's a way of taking something which previously existed and transforming it while the original form is still recognizable. And I can't go into that detail because I've got 15 seconds left, but you can see that approach coming through in my projects, like this interior, which was a sort of it was meant to be like a boudoir, purposefully sensual interior in Tokyo for a sort of an elderly couple who liked the approach. And okay, I'll just go for a minute more if you allow me, but ornament is color, and ornament is another factor. It's a way of breaking down the barriers between different cultures and different visual cultures in different countries. My international background sort of means that I'm not very necessarily open to this idea of contextuality and localism, which kind of makes us think in a nativistic way of just what's around us. Let's make bricks from the mud of the river next to us. I like to think of culture as something that is free flowing between countries. And okay, these are just projects that embody that. I'm an activist. I write about queerness in aesthetics from a particular angle. I'm happy to talk about that. People tend to get angry because they say there's no such thing as queer aesthetics, which I agree with. It's a project that just closed in Melbourne, which is a gender-fucked project, basically. It's just looking at a series of colors, forms, and graphical ornaments within space that are sort of ambiguous gender relationships. I will just flip through these very quickly. This is public works, and I think that queerness should be present not only in a programmatic way and through how lives are lived, but also as a mode of symbolic expression in space. And I think that's because seeing things that represent you is just as important as being able to exist in the space, because it valifies your existence in a powerful way. And these are all projects that hopefully do that. And I will end there because I'm over. So there was content there that I had to slip over, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam, for that colorful presentation. Our next speaker is Setareh Noorani. Setareh is an architect, researcher, and part of experimental music collective Zeneflute. In her projects, she uses various media to explore ways of unfolding and embodying, questioning processes of trauma and time, always in the gray space between academic and artistic research. Expressions of these include researching, disrupting, and exposing archives through spatial research and autonomous publications, for example, in her residency Shelter in Place, Shelter in Solidarity at Hotel Maria Capel, and the project The Elephant in the Room. Setareh will talk about her work at the Het Nieuw Institute as part of the new project Collecting Otherwise. And if time allows, she will maybe share some bits of a sister project on feminist design strategies. Welcome, Setareh.
Thank you. Wonderful first presentation by Adam, and I see many parallels also between my presentation that I will give and Adam's presentation. So without further ado, all right. Is that okay for you? Yes, perfect. So yeah, first, I would actually like to start circumscribing the Collecting Otherwise project, its study cases, its aims, intersections and proliferations with a quote in Sarah Ahmed's Queer Phenomenology, using this as an orientation device for our energies today. So the quote is, "Archives are made up of paper and other things that matter, and they take form insofar as they are intended for action. And we can recall here, following Derrida, that archives are homes, ways of gathering material around which worlds gather. It is thus in this domiciliation, in this house arrest, that archives take place. The dwelling, this place where they reside permanently, marks this institutional passage from the private to the public. If archives allow documents to dwell, then they too are orientation devices, which in gathering things around are not neutral but directive." So in this presentation, I would like to follow by drawing a few vignettes exemplifying different stages and subsequent questions asked within the Collecting Otherwise project. Here, I depart from the institutional and personal, drawing a blurry, crooked line between the two to lay bare toxic hegemonies present in architecture discipline, as Adam also did in a very, I felt it. Subsequently, in this presentation, I want to make a case for not going straight into the archive and archival research. So the collection of het Nieuwe Instituut contains about 800 archives of Dutch architects and urban planners. The focus of the collection until now has been to preserve and make available the national and international material traces of the Dutch history of architecture, urban design, and other related fields. Yet currently 97% of the collection is composed of documents authored by white male architects, with only 26 of 835 archives attributed to female architects. This means that the methodologies, gazes, and logics implemented in the past have not recognized the many other agents involved in important transformations of the built environment in the Netherlands. In recent years and through different initiatives, het Nieuwe Instituut has been bringing overlooked actors, unacknowledged agents, and forgotten stories into the discussion by examining the role that archives play in the construction of the history of cities, nations, and their inhabitants, as well as to contest the dominance of institutional memory and historiography. An example of current efforts is this project, which looks through feminist, queer, and decolonial lenses to highlight the often minority perspectives that are generally obscured by the standard architecture and archival practice. Collecting Otherwise, in this iteration this year, departs from old, rediscovered archives and new acquisitions, emphasizing the importance of tracing the genealogy of othering, viewing different roles designated to female, queer, Black bodies, and bodies of color in the national collection. So we will look now also in this presentation at the following case studies present in this year's iteration. So we have National Exhibition Women's Labor, 1898, Stichting Goed Wonen, Vrouwen Bouwen en Wonen, a few folders and letters in the Berlage archive, photo albums of Wim Dambone, and photos found in the archive of Adolf Eybink and Koen Lindberg. So in this project, we ask ourselves, what forms of acquisition should be revisited in the light of an intersectional feminist policy? What mechanisms of collecting have been in place? We aim to invest in research around the building of safer spaces, the organization around gendered labor relationships, notions of fluidity and bodily freedom in handed down practice, and the practice intertwined male gaze. So we can start with the first research vignette, the National Exhibition Women's Labor. And this archive is held by both het Nieuwe Instituut and Atria around different institutional collection mentalities. The archive of the Dutch National Exhibition of Women's Labor in 1898 is an archive that specifically shows the hidden roles of women in planning, design, and architecture. The National Exhibition itself also presented objects and practices from the former colonies. This exhibition was carefully designed and tried to fulfill many ideological purposes of bettering the place of the Dutch European woman in its nation state. The usage of the word vrouwenarbeid or women's work was intentional. It had to be regained from the negative connotations of failing leadership, male joblessness, and low pay. However, this betterment always still happened in the frame of socially acceptable, noble work, care work, as well as concepts of modern occupation and technological innovation, which was ascribed to the male in Western society. The strict ideology of women to the front that the committee held in the constitution of the exhibition was apparently weighed less in the colonial part of the fair. This is most likely tied to the fact that men were too emasculated in the former colonies. European women asserted their position against the highest ranked member of the colonized society. At the same time, the Netherlands knew a flourishing of their national identity and consciousness, which was explicitly colonial, taking forms of cognitive dissonance. Dutch women grabbed this opportunity to pose themselves as keepers of good moral, here as educators of those from the lower working class and there in the former colonies. We can say that the exhibition of women's labor was a revolution in what became a feminist consciousness, collective authorship, and formation of transnational networks, but also has to be understood in a maternalistic framework tied to class and colonialism, caring for and serving the mother nation. And this notion of the mother, we see again here, going forward to the 1950s and 60s. It is interesting to look at Stichting Goed Wonen, another case study. So better housing, in their opinion, would contribute to a more stable community with its stereotypical views on the nuclear family mirrored by Dutch society. Goed Wonen continued to reduce the role of women or mother to housewives, centering the ambition to make their tasks at home more efficient so they could dedicate more time to parenting and tasteful education, or tasteful decoration, claiming realms of domestic space through interior architecture and innovating on floor plans. Designers like Lucia Hartzyker-Curiel, who is named here in the article, rose up against patriarchal systems of control, thinking through their own bodies. So this shift was accelerated in the 1970s when a growing number of female practitioners in the fields of architecture, urban planning, and building engineering sought to collectivize in academic institutions in their professions. They took important cues from adjacent academic fields such as social sciences, philosophy, and psychology, taking position on the gendered reality of the built environment went hand in hand with dismantling the constructed binaries and hierarchies of the private and public spheres, housing and working activities, unpaid and paid labor, and claims on leisure time. This is where Vrouwen, Bouwen en Wonen gains major importance as a new acquisition, to better understand the kaleidoscopic map of national and international women's movements and work and spatial practice. Coming into existence after the first nationwide Congress for Women in the field of building in 1983, Vrouwen, Bouwen, Wonen stood up for equal rights and equal labor conditions in a practice directly influenced by the gendered inequalities present in society. Vrouwen, Bouwen en Wonen argued that choices in the built environment are literal reflections of the oppressive structures present, and that the relationship between both should be subject to critique. Here, I would like to make another important gesture that has happened more recently in the acquisition of the archive of Vrouwen, Bouwen en Wonen through the donor Liedewij Tummers, which you can see in the upper right image. So they had this amazing act of making their own non-linear timelines. So I would like to take this as a notion as well. And this is a striking form of constructing own her stories, taking ownership over that which is being told and forces of institutional centering and decentering. And with this, I would like to draw methodological parallels from these interrogations in the past to the current Collecting Otherwise working group, which is from its inception onwards explicitly intersectional. From the starting point of Collecting Otherwise, the opportunity we took to intersect ourselves with these case studies as a working group and within this institution, so het Nieuwe Instituut, we took the matter of interpersonal and intermaterial care seriously. What would the agency in this project be of the archive's constitutor, the rights holder, the people pictured, the landscapes traversed, following the archive as both a place and a metaphor for the production, maintenance, and surveillance of collective memory? And to conclude, I would like to leave us with three thoughts. One, of the living archive, the relational capacity of the archival material and narratives which reside in our bodies. Which parts should we seek to keep alive collectively? Can the archive unfold in transition with society? And second, a note on circumscribing the archive, about not going straight into the archive, but lingering with each other, asking questions around the visual material through the placement of our bodies and personal narratives. Here with Vim Dambone, who was amongst many things an avid constructor of his own personal and political reality. His archive was initially found in the garbage bin. Later, a family member brought some photo albums to the National Collection. Through the photo album that drew most attention to senior archivist Alfred Marx, we decided to go deeper, linger on, and have a look at the surrounding material. Here, we encountered the queer, not by the more explicit material that is often shown in presentations of het Nieuwe Instituut or research, but by Wim's non-compliant refusal to be only this or that. An intended interaction or intra-action between Vim Dambone's work and private life can be seen in the arrangement and echoing of images in all of his albums. So not only photo album 12, but also looking at photo album 11, 13, 14. The pride shared in all of them and the frustration stemming from the cover title Keurige leugens van het officieel fatsoen, so translated, the neat lies of the official decency. And I would like to close with the same refusal of the hegemony of the gap by inhabiting the gap, queering it, annotating it, making tangible, recognizable, felt, and leaving room for more to be invited in. So this was my talk. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. It was wonderful. Well, we have a couple of questions already, but I'm going to probably start with this idea about identity and practice that you mentioned briefly, Adam, when you talk about the use of social media to build your audience. And I was wondering about maybe if you can share a little bit of information about who are your clients? Are your clients also identify as queer? And if not, how they dialogue maybe with queerness in general, or I don't know, with your queerness specifically?
My clients, no, they're not. They're not predominantly queer at all. My my friends might be, but interestingly, I tend to attract a really nice range of people who simply are nonconformist in various ways. So people who like what they like and they don't really give a toss what other people say. And they are of all stripes and colors and backgrounds, and some of them might be queer, but I mean, I guess they're all queer in one way, but not necessarily in terms of who they sleep with. In terms of social media, what did you want to know, just in terms of how I used it, or?
No, I was just intrigued because you mentioned the use of social media to build your audience.
Yeah.
So that's why I was thinking about the client and this figure of, okay, who
I mean, it was vital. So I've never been sort of popular with the in crowd in the UK, which is it's a very narrow and sort of self-contained clique, or sort of overlapping, trio of cliques. And as gatekeepers, the kind of approach that I have would have never got air or been celebrated. And what was fantastic is kind of the early years of social media is different for young people nowadays. Social media has changed. It's not possible to do what I did anymore, but I managed to reach so many people in different parts of the world that it eventually filtered down to some people in very disparate places who just followed their own gut and would approach me and give me work. And there was absolutely no way in hell that I would have ever been able to have a career without social media. It was not possible. So those odd nonconformists were found through the long tail of the internet.
and thinking again about this identity and who is the user of this architecture. I was wondering for a question for Setareh, thinking in the museum setting. I mean, we don't speak about a client, but probably a museum visitor. So how this notion of queerness somehow can be a tool to rethink and reimagine like the entire presentation of the collection, and how visitors maybe at the Het Nieuw Institute are responding to that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there have been projects in the past, also of colleagues who I work with often, that have aimed to depict or narrate the queer in mostly evening programs. And I would say that collecting otherwise in a certain sense takes another stance of queering through breaking barriers or opposing binaries. So this barrier that the visitor should be kept out of certain types of information or the messiness of doing research, that is something that we inherently oppose in this project. So we employ like a really, I would say, fun, and also fun as another strategy of opposing just like this archive or the seriousness almost of the archive. strategy of making public and doing public research by using tools like Etherpad, by uploading 100 versions that are in progress for people to find their own bits of information in there, but also the working group meetings that are both intimate, the intimate ones that are monthly, but also the public ones that are every 2 or 3 months. They tend to experiment with formats. So in the last one, and it was actually last Thursday, we did, and it was like co-curated and hosted by working group members, always like that. And we have a few people in our working group that are in themselves another research cell. They call themselves a Trojan horse cell, because it's actually really interesting that, so the first person we asked, Clara Balaguer, she then brought in 3 of her research cellmates, Alfred Marasigan, Isola Tong, and Zar Christoph, into this, what was first constructed as, you know, like the working group, but then it became more fluid by more people merging in, almost as sort of like this collective body or this organism of different cells coming in. And then during last working group meeting, they hosted, they brought in an invitee of themselves, so someone they invited, additional speaker, and they called it mingling. And this mingling, this getting to know by like really brief and fun questions, is also another take or querying a visitor's perspective on what research can be, or what archival research could be, around, you know, topics that I think in the presentation that I gave, like, have a certain gravity, also just can put you in some kind of gridlock already by interrogating them and researching them, and then you just need some kind of respite in this collectivity.
Great, that sounds wonderful. We have a question to Adam from the audience. Jason asked, you described your encounters with societal and institutional academic disdain for queerness. And thank you for sharing your experience, by the way. What is your sense of architecture education now with respect to queerness? Are queer contributions to architecture being acknowledged, appreciated, discussed in your part of the world?
Yes, is a simple answer. I mean, I wish I was a student now, you know, to put it very simply. I'm really happy with the, I mean, just generally, it's not only in relation to queerness, but in relation to multiple other forms of identity. There simply is the space to be able to talk about that. So I think that it's improved a lot in terms of the education environment. I don't think it's improved at all in terms of the profession in the UK. So I think there's a kind of generation, particularly sort of the Generation Z students that I have been lucky enough to be on the panels of, on the crits of, that I've been lucky enough to teach. They're much more in tune, and they have a sort of strength in themselves of putting their beliefs forward and being sort of proud of who they are. And they're sort of used to a world, I guess, outside that they've been brought up with, that tells them actually more, or it doesn't put them down in the same way that it used to. But I think going into the profession, there will be quite a shock, because I don't think officers have changed very much. I don't think the planning discourse, it's probably 20 years behind. I don't think it really, you know, is up to the same level of the kind of the conversations that are being had at university. Another I guess another point that I would have is that there's a kind of fear in architecture of expression, and I think that at least everything I say is from the context of London or the UK, but mostly London. There's an idea that architects must present themselves as vessels, empty vessels, which are conduits for, you know, presenting or the program or a local community. But actually, that's actually an illusion, because obviously you always have to give form to what to those sort of intangible forces that come through. You have to give form to them, and that form is always defined by the academy, and kind of peer accepted aesthetics. And I think there's a fear of anybody saying, yes, I'm an architect, and I'm a queer architect, or I'm a Black architect, or a female architect, and actually I would like to design in a way that looks different to how you, Mr. Brick Grids, or you, Mr. Sophisticated Concrete, design, and which is considered neutral and just a vessel for the local community. I want to put myself into the design in a way that's visually present. That, because of the lie that we're empty vessels, means that there's, for me at least, there's the kind of symbolic paucity, there's a kind of symbolic exclusion that happens still even at university. You know, the amount of projects I've seen of somebody doing something for a local community that picks up some aspect of tradition from that community and then uses it, rather than bringing themselves to the project and kind of engaging in a sort of fusion of the two. So yeah, it's much better, but obviously could improve a lot.
Yes, and probably to Jason, if you are interested in education, the last two sessions of this talk series talk a little bit about education in terms of gender and race. So you can visit the Casa Vertigo YouTube channel. And actually, Arun Betsky was one of the speakers last week. I was thinking about maybe Setareh, if you can share a little bit more on this notion of the living archive and the body, because I feel a connection also when Adam mentioned this notion of the interiors and how objects are part of that, of these atmospheres. So maybe if you can just give us a little bit more information on that.
Definitely. Yeah, I was picking up on that as well. And yeah, if you didn't ask that question, I would have asked myself to Adam. And I think I first would like to traverse through the last question that was raised about architecture education, because I also have some, like parallels of my own. I graduated now 2 years ago, and from Technical University of Delft. And honestly, I only became aware of the power of inserting my body or interrogating space through my body when I entered a master's education in Delft. In the sense that in the bachelor, indeed, you are seen, the architect or the designer is seen as fulfilling a set program. You have to do X, Y, and Z, and you have to do it well, and you have to sort of place yourself in the ultimate, the end user. But then I think as I reached sort of the last few years of my education, and also encouraged by a few teachers, and it's always wonderful what teachers can do for you in education, and then thinking, okay, what is the effective capacity of my body in these spaces, or when doing field research, how can I do it in such a way that I feel a certain closeness or kinship with that which is which I'm researching. And I think sort of like getting it to my graduation project, which was about archives and the body, and making cuts through the archive, almost like these incisions, and pasting together, collaging, but also going through a certain landscape with my own body, and having these types of, how do you say that, realizations, and then building further up on them, like granting value to bodily perception. I think I took that to the research that I'm doing now at Nieuwe Instituut. And there's this beautiful thing of people gathering in a working group that is just like almost self-organizing, well, after a few months of like trial and error, but also like embracing this trial and error, now everyone finding its sort of niche or places, and through their own bodies. I mean, myself being non-conforming, Black, and so on and so on. I have my own blind spots, and I have my own frictions with other people's intersections, and these overlaps are, I think, I've been really blessed to witness that, and I learn every day. So I think indeed sort of interrogating the object, but also just like sort of this almost this onion, like the object, and then the narratives around it, or like the societal constructions around that type of object, the donor, the archivist, the curator, and so on. So like and the working group and the interpersonal relationships in the working group as well. It's amazing to see in how many ways you can relate to each other, but also to the object.
Can I quickly ask Setareh, like how? I mean, it just sounds so fascinating, this notion of the kind of this process of kind of self-evolving conversations. But how do you document that?
So what we do is, and I will drop the link in a bit, we document it in various places. So earlier in the presentation, I showed this, like this image of a lot of secretaries or people doing like this typing work. We took it, this gendered labor of being the secretary, but also the secretary as the actual constructor of heritage, not the chairman or woman, but the person who was taking notes. We took that role upon ourselves as members of the working group, and in varying constellations, we make notes in Google Drive, in Etherpad. Sometimes we write longer text about it and place it on our web magazine. But these various ways of disseminating and are also pushing the boundaries of authorship. So we almost never place our own names with that which we write. And that's another cue that we take from Vrouwen Bouwen en Wonen, because as a collective, obviously they struggled to sort of maintain a certain, how do you say it, maintain the capacity to perform action. Because if sometimes the danger is also in anarchist collectives that if things remain too horizontal, action can be dissipating. But in another sense, this can be harnessed and sort of this and be taken to free yourself from labor you do not want to perform if you share it equally.
I have a question for you both from Carolina. She asked Adam, I would like to ask Adam to expand a bit this idea and relevance of embodiment in his work as a vehicle to produce physical, touchable objects beyond images. And she wonders if you have entered into smells as well, for example. And if you allow me, I can pose a question for Setareh. She asked Setareh if you can maybe talk a little bit about the voice as a very powerful bodiless mechanisms to transmit memories within archives. Yeah, whatever. Yeah, go ahead, Setareh, if you want to.
Yeah. So the voice, and it's actually really funny that this question is being raised, because with this, again, with the acquisition of Vrouwen Bouwen en Wonen, and with a lot of members of the collective still living, there's this wonderful opportunity to record her stories, their narratives, and through this voice also like carry forward certain nuances. And I mean, on a more ephemeral level, the voice and the way that it sets tone, or sort of how it breaks apart and how certain things are articulated, is also so powerful to capture and let become material a certain trace of speech, or that which is normally written, or also to contest the power of the written word that is commonly utilized in Western contexts as the main source of, I would say, knowledge or knowledge making. And I have to think of another gathering that we had previous week, where Dionne Goedhoop, also a researcher and historian, told about the kitchen stories of her grandmother, and how that is also an archive in itself, and how these how to say, non-institutional forms of memory making, and it's also something often said during the working group meetings, and mainly by those that do not habit currently in Western countries, is that that's a lot of times the only thing that they have, like these narratives or these forms of archive making that reside out of the institutions, because they do not have the same institutions. So also the capacity for us to remember the stories of our fathers, mothers, grandmothers, and so on. Or even if I think of my own mother, like she's Somali, and she can count on her knuckles the names of all of our forefathers down to the last one. And it's something so special or powerful also to be able to do that through your own body and that which is in your mind.
So it was about embodiment. Yeah. So in terms of my work, yeah. I mean, look. Fundamentally, everything is for me has. I mean, I think it is for most people. I guess it's just I've been, like most of us here, probably have been forced to understand that most things in my life are personal because I've had to stand up for them. But they do come down to my body fundamentally. I've was always made to. That was quite personal. What I was talking about, I've always was very much made to feel ashamed of my body, not to fit in. And feeling very uncomfortable around people. Bullying and abuse has left me unable to deal with a lot of social situations. So collectives are actually quite traumatic for me. Like I find it very, very difficult to negotiate conflict, and discussion can sometimes feel like conflict. And because of that, the world of objects has always been things, material things. So the things that I can commune with on an individual and a private basis, which I can project meaning onto and have relationships with, have always been deeply meaningful to me. So actually, if I was forced to produce a lot of digital stuff, visual stuff, things which exist on the page or things which exist on Instagram, that's absolutely not my comfortable medium. I am obsessed with the physicality and the sensuality of things, because that's kind of like my inanimate world of friends. And actually, I got into buildings and architecture in the very first place because I had no friends, and the city was my friend. And looking up and noticing little things, and the little statue that was leaning off of somebody's balcony with a chain just behind a tree, the kind of strange boar's head which was sitting just above an ornamental arts and crafts scroll. These things became my world and my friends. And as I got older, all that happened was that deepened, and I found out about their histories, and I discovered antiques and objects. And I guess the licking, the touching, the sensuality, which when I used to make films, I don't, unfortunately I don't do that anymore, but that is because precisely it's about my body's relation to things that I care about. And it is the look, it's also the touch, it is also the sound. The sound matters a lot to me. I'm completely obsessed with it. How things sound when you slip on them, when you flick them. I love the ringing of thin surfaces over a certain area, and the way they ring, unless they're cracked, at which point they don't ring. And smells, absolutely. So I have very strong memories of wood smells in Japan when I was growing up, and that interior that I showed you, the kind of sensual boudoir, incorporates untreated wood, which has a sort of perfume which emanates around that space. So yeah, it's for me, it's very much about a kind of private relationship between the body and the things that make it feel not alone, which are not animate, if that makes sense. Which is, I'm very happy that Setareh showed Sarah Ahmed's book, because it's a wonderful book, and I feel like that says it speaks a lot about, when I read that, I felt like this is talking about me a lot of the time.
Maybe we can have a last question just to before finishing. Emily asked, and this is a question that I see in other conversations about queerness and so on. She asked if it's if we can if these notions about queer in architecture or collecting otherwise are inevitably making up for the past, let's say for the ignorance, homogeneity of previous dominant discourses. Is it a question of shifting the power back, or is more like a duty, or you see this as a natural movement that is happening? How do you see this?
Yeah, I mean, all good questions. I think I would like to respond with more question, or just like a sort of a loose, fixed conjuring of thought. And first of all, inhabiting the gap or queering the gap, that stems from and again, like me talking about collecting otherwise is always talking about myself as myself, personal, myself as precarious worker, myself as a host of a lot of other bodies, but also myself as someone who has to work in an institution and also has to provide lists at the end for the review and so on. And how these things are often marked, and you must know without doubt in institutions, is that you need to reach certain targets and certain gaps need to be filled. We need to know more. And it's this like liberal mode of conquering almost. It's like this, like colonizing the gap, I would say. And I want to move away from this and feel okay with this silence and sort of softly caress it and circumscribe it. And then when one feels ready, just like go in and then go out again, like almost as a dance. And that's also why I used Sarah Ahmed's quote, because it's just this tracing or this drawing of a line, and the line can never ever be straight, and the answer is also never ever straight up. And another thing is about care and the various forms of care. So like I could feel that in your usage of the word duty as myself, sort of, I don't know, like I wouldn't say mother, but like sort of having a certain parenthood or ownership over something. So I feel the duty, and I would not necessarily want to frame it so, but then where does my urgency stem from? It's more of a, I believe I could not do it otherwise.
Do you want to add something, Adam?
Oh, sorry, the initial, can you remind me of the initial question?
She was asking about if these notions are making up for the past, like sort of like amending mistakes, or is more like a duty that we have to embark on, or maybe it's a natural sort of like movement, natural in quotes.
I mean, I think it's natural, because whenever a group of people or an individual becomes self-conscious, as in aware of itself and not having to hide, they automatically want to have a past. It's the very first thing that you want to do. You want to root yourself. So I think I think it's just a natural outgrowth. It's a natural outgrowth of the fact that liberal society has kind of created us in a way, and we're sort of pushing back in a way now and saying, you know, now that we exist and we're getting rights, we also need to know what our history was, and of course that history was not documented, was actively suppressed. So it's an interesting state where we want a history, but the history isn't there, but we know there was a history. And you know, Michael, the book that you're part of, that I'm working on, it's, you know, very much dealing with that, as you know, Setareh's archive will have to deal with it all the time. Most of it is missing. You're dealing, it's, you know, the gap is everything. It's a little bit like dark matter is 85% of the universe. You know, we are the dark matter, but we're there, and we were there. And so, and for me, I feel a very strong affinity to this, because my family heritage is just, it's a void. You know, it's a history of loss and absence, destruction, trauma, you know, the absence of history. And it's a sort of, the recent generations have been the kind of forceful fight to try and build their own reality and their own history, which is kind of unreal, but kind of relates to their own personal, and I sort of thinking my grandmother, my mother, like their own ideas of what their past should have been or might have been, or is, for them to make themselves feel comfortable in the world. And I think, you know, I'm not one of those people that wants to undermine the liberal idea of, you know, a constructed history which is based on facts, but I do think that there is plenty of room for us to make all sorts of appendary histories which can give us the past that we need, that the majority already has.
Yeah, that was,
I think it's a human need, basically.
Yeah, that's a wonderful sort of like concluding statement. Well, time is up, unfortunately. We have to finish now. Thank you again for joining our talk today. And please make sure to join us next Tuesday, where CRC member Emily Banville will be addressing issues on race in the architecture profession. Thank you, Setareh. Thank you, Adam. Thank you to everybody, and have a nice night. Have a happy Pride Month. So, ciao.